course, is in the SABC studio at Nascrec, and she's got her eye on the ground there, as well as all of our reporters. So, SK, I'm not sure if we are expecting this to start any moment. It looks quite empty to me. Doesn't look like anyone is there as yet on the podium, but that's still 5 minutes to go. Lots happens in 5 minutes. SK, let me hand it back to you.
Indeed, Leanne, and of course we are monitoring those developments, so if anything happens, we'll take you there as soon as it does. But of course, in the meantime, as promised, we're continuing to take a closer look and scrutinizing the policy discussion documents, and that of course is the main thrust of why this particular conference is sitting. And I'm joined now by ANC NEC member head of Economic Transformation Mmamoloko Kubayi. Thanks so much for stopping by. So firstly, just in terms of the program, are you able to give us any sort of update at this stage?
Look, in terms of this weekend, you'd know that we are meeting with the delegates from various provinces. Our leagues, alliance partners will be in plenary today, but of the morning, afternoon, it will be commissions. Which will start with more organizational issues around organizational renewal, balance of forces, those are discussion documents. And then tomorrow we'll start with commissions on, for example, economic transformation, security, and all other as more of sectoral. And then on Sunday, it's reporting back. So we are looking forward to more discussions. It's about engagements in commissions more, where delegates and all of us will have an opportunity to engage on the proposal of the documents that are there, and almost delegates will be carrying their mandates from their provinces. If you would have noticed last week, most of the provinces held their provincial general council. So they are holding mandates in terms of their discussions in what they are coming here to pursue as discussions.
What about the Northwest?
Yeah, Northwest, I'm not so sure if Northwest was able, I was not able to follow through because over the weekend I was in KZN. From there I went to Mpumalanga, which is my province of deployment as a member of the NEC. So having that, I'm not so sure, maybe the Secretary General can answer broadly on administrative issues around the organization.
Fair enough. Coming to the economic situation in the country and the backdrop against which this is happening, we've got inflation at over 7%. We're sitting on a 13-year high. I think it's at 7.4% at the moment. You have fuel price increases of more than 6 rand over 2 months, and just basic, mayhem as far as the socio-economic conditions that South Africans find themselves having to navigate is at. So speak to us about your policy discussion document and how you think it will address these situations.
No, in terms of the current economic environment, both of them would have domestic matters or influences and also international influence. The Russia and Ukraine conflict continues to impact negatively on the global markets and in terms of what we are seeing across the globe. So it's not only South Africa that is battling with the economic environment around the fuel prices and also inflations. Many of the reserve banks across the globe have been raising concerns and trying to manage that. So for us here looking at South Africa and what we are seeing South Africans be faced with, high unemployment, the issues around, as we say, cost of living going high, while salaries are maintained at the same level, so meaning that it's becoming difficult for South Africans to survive. So part of the discussion will be to look at, for example, many of the people are raising whether there is a need for us to review the mandate of the Reserve Bank currently. That discussion was there in the last conference where even resolutions were taken around nationalization of the Reserve Bank. We expect delegates to continue to raise that. Part of what we are doing from the Economic Transformation Subcommittee was to say we'll give report back in the commissions to say how far we've gone with that, what has been the difficulties, for example, in terms of getting the Reserve Bank to be 100% publicly owned, and what we are recommending. One of the things that we would be recommending is to say we need to do a bit of a study before December, because you understand here is discussions and adoption of these resolutions will be in December. Just to look at how other countries have migrated from private ownership to public ownership, what has been the consequences, so that when we have these discussions and take these decisions, it's evidence-based in December. So that's one area. But we do think that delegates will also raise the issue around the mandate of the Reserve Bank, whether it needs to also take into consideration not only inflation targeting, but also looking at can we be able to deal with the issues around unemployment and also support and the transformation of the financial sector. That we're expecting. We do believe that inflation targeting still have to remain. Whether we expand the mandate is something that we can look into. Whether the current system with the National Treasury in terms of mandating and giving instruction to or engaging with the Reserve Bank is sufficient, that's what we'll discuss. The reason why we would want to continue with the inflation targeting as one of the mandates to be focused on and not drop that ball. It's around what we are seeing, for example, in Sri Lanka. We would have seen other countries such as Zimbabwe with inflation, where you end up, for example, a loaf of bread can easily cost more than 200. And that's what we think will be having more consequences to the system, to the country, and to the consumers more. And that's why the inflation targeting remains quite important for us.
So with regard to the expansion of the scope of the Reserve Bank, obviously that's a discussion that you say will take place. But in the previous conference, you resolved that the Reserve Bank should be 100% owned by state. And you just about touched on it, where you said that international best practice is what you look at. International best practice shows that reserve banks are not, by their nature, owned by private entities. So what has been the stumbling block for South Africa in order to address this and for the ANC to make sure that this is implemented?
Look, the challenge for us was, when we got the report, was that at the minute that we took that resolution, shareholders who are holding private shares in the Reserve Bank started demanding a lot of money. And part of what we are bringing to conference is to say, is to ask whether there should be, at some point, where we deal with what we'd call in private companies market-sensitive discussions. Because if you have certain discussions in public which have actually value and market money-related values, where people can escalate the costs or what they're demanding because they know that this is a decision that you have taken. So in private equity, in private entities and corporates, for example, those discussions don't come to the fore until agreements have been reached. And we are taking that as part of some of the things that we'll report back to a conference this weekend.
So you are probably aware of the criticism by most economists of the lack of macroeconomic policy outlook from your discussion documents. How do you respond to that?
I don't think, I've listened to some. I was shocked actually when we engaged, because I just feel that the criticism is unfair. Because when you look at it, for example, what I just talked about, it's macroeconomic because it's monetary policy. It's covered in the discussions. We are reflecting on it. The fiscal policy, we've covered it on the document. I think sometimes the criticism comes when people want us to say certain things that they don't like. For example, one of the things that we're talking about on the fiscal policy, we are saying we've got to continue to maintain and ensure that we are paying our debt. So management of the debt is important because we don't want to risk the sovereignty of the country. Secondly, we are saying in terms of budget and fiscal policy, we've got to continue to ensure that we're dealing with the triple challenges, unemployment, poverty, and inequality, but also our budget must be people-centered approach. There's been misunderstanding or misconstrued conversations around how we are dealing with the fiscal policy, where people believe that we have tended to be almost like a constraint, or what, not constraint, but almost like we are reducing the spending and almost like not spending enough and like reducing the budget cuts. And what we have explained, and which I continue to explain, is that when you look at the budget cuts, for example, and how we've been able to reprioritize, it's because we've not had new money coming. So because the economy has not been growing, the revenue has not been growing much. We've seen previous, with February, the financial year, Minister Kodongwani said, no, we've seen some increase, but it's not sufficient to cover all our needs. Now, what we have been doing is to look at where the departments, for example, or programs have not been performing, and you redirect the funds to where you need. For example, we redirected the funds from various projects into COVID-19 response, which was necessary for the country to do that. And then out of that, and I can tell you, for example, human settlements as my department is one of the departments that would have received a cut. And part of the issues is that the department itself has not been spending enough. So one of the things I say to my team is that before we can complain about the budget cuts, can we spend what we are allocated? Make sure that we deliver on the services. Let's make sure that we spend, and then we go to Treasury to say, this is how much we have spent this, and we have shortage of money. You can't say you have shortage of money when you have not even spent the budget that you have. You can look at almost expenditure across our departments. So that has been a management, because we don't want to borrow money and then it comes and sits in accounts and generate. That's not the intention. And again, the issue of
structurally, and I think this is where the macroeconomic policy criticism stems from. Have you done enough structurally to change the face of the economy in South Africa?
But that's not only the responsibility of the fiscal policy or the monetary policy.
No, it isn't. But have you done enough?
No, I can say that not yet, not yet. There's been steps to do it, and it's not only the responsibility of government. And that's why policies would talk about even transformational issues. So part of the responsibility is that, and that's why you'd see the the resolution around social compacting, precisely, talks about identifying that all of us have a responsibility to play. So you've got the businesses that have a responsibility to play, to contribute to changing the face of the economy in this country. We've got labor as well to assist us, again government. So from our part as government, there are, yes, things that we've been able to do. There are things that we need to do, more importantly, increase. One of the things around transformation would say, we have had intentions to do transformational agenda. For example, when I was in tourism equity fund, which was meant to change the face of tourism ownership in the country. It was taken to court. Is still sitting in court, challenged. Now, you can't say there's no intention from the ANC government to transform, for example, tourism sector. So when you look at some of those things, you'd see that there's intentions in the process that's huddled. Now, part of what we are doing,
is
even
there
in this
sufficient
conference,
intention, though? Overall, do you believe that there is sufficient intention?
I do believe,
and
Sakina,
actual implementation of your own policy positions? Let me take you to the situation around poverty and unemployment as an example. So the ANC's objective, I'm not sure if it can't still be, was to halve poverty by 2014 in South Africa. 2014 is long past, we're almost a decade on. But in 2012, this is what the ANC resolved in that regard, that the ANC-led government has developed the National Development Plan as the overarching framework to guide and accelerate the development of South Africa by 2030 and beyond. That was 2012. 2017, recalling and reaffirming the ANC's 53rd National Conference, embraced the National Development Plan Vision 2030 as a platform for united action by South Africans to eradicate poverty, create full employment, reduce inequality, critical building blocks towards a truly united, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic and prosperous South Africa. How would you assess the ANC's progress in that regard?
Sakina, if we look at what we have said in the last conferences around issues of dealing with poverty, I'll start there. With dealing with poverty, our intention has been to ensure that the majority of South Africans, or we have no one living below poverty line. That's why we have our social packages in South Africa. We're one of the best countries in the global in communities that we're able to provide that, and it's specifically to deal with poverty. That's why during COVID, we intervened with the 350 interventions that we were paying for South Africans. That's why you'd have today, we're talking about basic income grant. It's recognition that we have taken a resolution to intervene and ensure that South Africans don't live below poverty line. So that's clear indication of dealing with poverty.
No, it isn't.
It is.
No, it isn't. And I'll tell you why it isn't.
I'll come to the employment.
I'll tell you why it isn't. Because in the first instance, the ANC's objective was to halve poverty by 2014. That failed miserably. And since then, almost a decade on, South Africa has become even more unequal as a society.
No.
So how do you then say that you are actually making strides and inroads into dealing with the poverty crisis in the country? We are not making strides.
No, Sakina, when you do index measurements for inequality, for poverty and unemployment are different. So that's what I'm saying. On poverty, the index on dealing with poverty is that you must ensure that people are not living below poverty line.
How many South Africans are living below the poverty line right now?
Poverty line is that I must recall, because they've reviewed, UN has reviewed the figure. I think it was about $7 per household per month. So that's why I'm talking about the income that we're talking about. That's why the intervention of 350 is dealing with poverty. I'll come to the unemployment. That's why I said, I'll come to the unemployment. I agree on unemployment and I'll come and explain why. But on poverty, this is making sure that households have basic necessities to eat and have food. And that's why the intervention of the 350 is to deal with poverty, so that people don't go to bed without even basic food. The intervention not big, it's around poverty. Now, coming to unemployment, we've committed to halving, to reducing, and the issue when you say we failed dismally, there are no statistics that shows that we have failed on dealing with poverty in 2014, beyond 2014. When we come to the issues around dealing with unemployment, you would have seen that prior to COVID, we were starting to see some level of increase in terms of employment, but then we were hit by COVID, and sectors such as mass unemployment, what we call labor-intense sectors, then were affected, and we saw the drop. But again, load shedding and energy issues affected us more, because in terms of the sectors, you would have seen a decrease of performance of sectors. For example, high-intense labor sectors where they need to utilize a lot of electricity then dropped. And that's where the crisis currently is. The crisis of unemployment, there we acknowledge that there is definitely a lot of work that needs to be done. And that's why when you look at the document, you'll see that we're talking about government's role on creating employment, the mass employment program. We also identify sectors. Specifically, one of the criteria why those sectors are identified is because they have potential to assist us to intervene on the issues around unemployment. So that's why I'm saying, if we separate the indexes and you look at them, you'll see there's a difference. Then you come to inequality. South Africa becomes one of the most unequal society. And part of the reason why we have now proposed that if we are to deal with basic income grant, where we give people who do not have an income, a basic income grant, we are saying it must have conditions so that people can be linked to either skills and they can exit the basic income grant system. But one of the things of where people are asking us, how are you going to fund it? We are saying we need to fund it with wealth tax. Now, it's part of reducing the inequalities, because you can't continue to have 5% of the population carrying majority of the wealth in the country. So as part of dealing with that and also addressing the issue around inequality, that's the issue that we're dealing with. We are raising that in the document. And then we talk about the pay gap and also the issues around equal pay, equal job. President was talking about Bafana and Banyana. And that's one of the issues that is on the fore, just to make it as simple as that, so that people understand. And we know in farm environment or agricultural environment, we have this more. Some in the tourism space, you still have the issues around unequal or even not basic income, where people are based on issues around tips that it becomes their. So we're dealing with that as well, because it's part of the issues around inequality. The issue around tax, where the higher you earn, the higher tax you get. It's also dealing with the issues around inequalities to try and bring down. And you know, Labour and especially SABC would be very strong and vocal around these areas, where they assist us to bring us back as ANC, even when we get out of line around those issues.
They've not brought you back on anything. And besides, just on those stats, Minister, in April 2022, South Africa's stats, so according to monthly surveys that were conducted in South Africa, those worried, and this is by Stats SA, about social inequality and poverty in the country was at 34%. 11% of South Africans go to bed hungry. They are food insecure. How is that winning the battle?
That's why I'm saying, Sakina, hence the conversation around big now, because we intervene with 350. And I can say that part of the frustration you'd have from government point of view, and if you talk to Minister Lindiwe Zulu, will explain to you, we make provision, and sometimes we find that because of inefficiencies in the system, the wrong people end up getting the interventions, and that's why we must improve on the efficiencies, because with the intervention around 350, it meant that those people who are meant to go to bed without food are the ones that receive that system. And that's why most of the time you have noted over time, there was reluctance of introduction of basic income grant. Now there's acceptance that there is a need for basic income grant. And the basis of that is that we have populations that would be affected because they need to have food. So we acknowledge that there is a gap, and that's why we are responding to it. But from the economic transformation, we are saying it shouldn't be unconditional.
Well, much more to discuss, and of course, please stay with us here on Morning Live, and SABC News has you covered on our various platforms. We'll continue these discussions. Thanks to Mmamoloko Kubayi, ANC NEC member, talking to us there about the economic transformation document, and of course, we'll be unpacking more of that with Angelo Fick as well. Please stay with us.